Hi everyone, my name is Anna Stockstad. I'm an extension forester with U of M. I'm based in Cloquet at the Cloquet Forestry Center, and I live in Duluth. And I'm really excited to be up here with you all today talking about spruce budworm. And I'm going to be starting off this presentation on spruce budworm with my colleague Sarah. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Waddell. I'm a local extension educator here in Cook County, and my office is just up the road in the community center. You're in the right place, yeah. And I work on both natural resources, agriculture and food stuff, and all kinds of ways to connect the local Cook County community with resources from the University of Minnesota. So happy to chat after this about ideas you have for that and to connect with all of you.
So I'll give you a quick rundown of our plan for today. We have an hour and a half together. And Sarah and I are going to start off by giving about a 45-minute presentation on spruce budworm. And then Erin from Cook County Firewise is going to come up and talk about Firewise principles. And then we'll have about 30 minutes for questions and discussion. And we have some spruce samples with spruce budworm defoliation and pupa on them. And so we'll pass those around so you can get up close and identify spruce budworm. And we can just have a good period of question and answer and discussion. And then Sarah is going to start out this first portion of the presentation.
Thanks. So, as we get into talking about spruce budworm, it's important to make sure we're all on the same page of what we're talking about. You can see up on the screen, there's pictures of both the moth and the larva phase of the same insect. So when people say spruce budworm, they might be talking about either life stage of this same insect. You probably saw these moths flying around about a month ago when they hatched out of the pupas, but earlier this summer in May and June, you might have seen these larvae on your trees. The trees that they like to eat the most, their preferred species are balsam, fir, and spruce. But they can also feed on other conifer species when their populations are really high. I saw them on my tamarack tree in my front yard this summer. I've seen them on white pines in other people's yards as well. If you're wanting to know how to tell if what you're looking at is a spruce budworm for sure, there are a few things to look for. It's a pretty small caterpillar, about a ½ inch long when you see them on the trees. But even easier than the caterpillars themselves to see is some clues on the tree. So often the trees will have these kind of messy web-like structures on the very tips. The place they like to feed is on that fresh new growth, the bright green stuff that comes out right in the spring. And you'll find them hanging out on those tips of the trees. They make that messy web around themselves for protection. And if you step back from the tree and look at the whole thing, you can also often see this kind of rust color on the top of the tree. Looks like it's been scorched as if a big heat came and got it, but that's the feeding of the budworm. And then this time of year, after they've hatched into moths, you can also be looking for those pupa casings that you'll see when we pass around these samples later. I think they look like little tiny brown ice cream cones on the trees. When you're thinking about the trees in your yard and in your woods and how susceptible they are to defoliation and to death from feeding by spruce budworm, the most susceptible tree is the balsam fir. As you can see on the chart, they last a lot shorter than a spruce, so they'll die after just a few years of being having heavy feeding from the budworm. Spruce trees last a bit longer. They can also die from this defoliation, but they'll tend to last more like 5 to 7 years compared to the just 3 to 4 years for the balsam fir. If you're looking sort of on your whole woods scale, the key to having a resilient forest stand that's going to be able to withstand these impacts from spruce budworm is to have diversity in the woods. So if you have woods that are mostly all just balsam fir, that really dense kind of tree, all balsam fir, those are going to be impacted really heavily, and you can expect to lose most of those trees. Versus if you have in your yard or woods a lot of different species of trees, or maybe there's some balsam and some spruce and some others, those will be more likely to not be as impacted by this outbreak that we're in right now. On the left-hand side on this slide, you can see a map showing the whole range of balsam fir in the gray. So, you know, it matches up with where the boreal forest is. We're at kind of the southern tip of the boreal forest here, and you can see most of it's up into Canada. This striped shows in 2011 where they saw defoliation by spruce budworm. Over here on the right, you can see this is a map from last year that was put out by the DNR showing in red in northeastern Minnesota the areas that were affected by spruce budworm. The darker the color, the more effect was seen. So you can see in 2022, Lake County highly, highly impacted, and coming up here into Cook County. I would expect when we see this map next year showing this summer, 2023, we'll see a lot more of that darker red color from up here in Cook County. Now, as I mentioned, spruce budworm is a native insect. It's been in our area for a long time, and it's highly adapted to the type of forest that we have here. The first written down record of a spruce budworm outbreak in Minnesota is from 1912, but we've had a continuing population, which means that it gets higher and lower, but never completely goes away, since about the 1950s. And outbreaks occur in the same area every 25 to 40 years. So you can expect we're in a major outbreak right now, and in another 25 to 40 years, this will happen again in our area. And in general, the outbreaks last for about 6 to 10 years. So in Cook County, people really started noticing this, I would say, some last year and going into this year. So you can subtract that. You can expect 4, 7 more years-ish of what we're seeing right now. And the ecology of spruce budworm is really complicated. There's this diagram is from a study that I was reading where they were studying the food web associated with balsam fir. So all those lines are showing different species that are eating each other or being impacted by each other in the food web, which means that budworm has a lot of different other species that eat it or are impacted by it. And the dynamics of what causes it to grow and grow and grow and then go back down again are complicated. It's not just one thing. You know, when I was first hearing about it, I thought, well, maybe it's just when they eat through all the balsam fir in the area, that's when the population goes back down. And that's part of it, their food source, but there's other things involved as well. Lots of insects that like to eat the spruce budworm that also grow and grow and grow when the budworm's growing, and that can impact when the population goes back down. Birds love to eat them, other mammals and things too. So it's a bigger story than just the balsam fir and the budworm itself. And these cycles of change in the forest are a totally normal part of the ecology of our forests up here, which Anna's going to talk about some more.
So I'm going to give you a quick update on where we currently are in the outbreak in Minnesota. And so last year in 2022, we had almost 500,000 acres in Minnesota that were impacted by spruce budworm defoliation or mortality. And this is actually the highest number of acres that have been recorded since 1995. And on average, since 2018, about 320,000 acres per year are impacted on average by spruce budworm. And when we look at that trend on a chart, really see that the number of acres impacted by spruce budworm have been increasing pretty steadily, especially since 2010. But this is showing since 2010 to 2022, just that continuous increase in the number of acres impacted by spruce budworm. And you can really see that stark increase in about the last 5 years. But then here we look at 2006 and we see a really big spike that it's pretty much on the same level as what we've been experiencing in the last 5 years. So what happened in 2006? That caused this big number of acres impacted by spruce budworm. In the summer of 2006, there was something that we call a flash drought. And a flash drought is an extreme drought that occurs during an already very hot growing season. And so it is a very high intensity, but a short period of drought. And this is showing us that linkage between spruce budworm impacts and drought. And usually we will see a big increase in the amount of mortality caused by spruce budworm when there's already a drought occurring. And that's because when there's a drought, that's putting a lot of stress on the trees. And when trees are very stressed, they're unable to withstand the impacts from other stressors, for example, like spruce budworm. So during the drought, the spruce budworm came in, stressed out all that balsam fir and white spruce and caused mortality because those trees just couldn't withstand the impacts of that spruce budworm. And we saw the same thing in 2021, again, when we experienced a drought. And as you all know, this is when the Greenwood fire occurred in summer of 2021. And so again, this is showing the link between drought and spruce budworm. And unfortunately, when we have all of that mortality from drought and spruce budworm, that is a lot of dead balsam fir and spruce on the landscape. And that greatly increases our fire risk and can lead to catastrophic fires like the Greenwood fire. And fire is a natural part of our landscape, but of course we want to be avoiding these catastrophic fires that threaten our homes and communities. And the overabundance of balsam fir, especially, that was dead due to spruce budworm, was a major contributor to that Greenwood fire in 2021. So now let's think a little bit more deeply about the life cycle of spruce budworm and how that relates to the impacts that we see on our landscape here. So in July and August, the adult moths are flying, and you all saw those adult moths about a month ago, and they're relatively nondescript. They're about 1 inch in size, look like pretty much any other moth. But what makes them really interesting is that spruce budworm moths are very efficient flyers. They've actually been recorded flying 125 miles in one night in Canada. So they are very good at flying long distances and expanding the range of their population. And as they're flying, they can make stops and lay eggs at multiple different sites. So again, they're spreading their population and expanding their range. And luckily, they can only produce 1 generation of eggs per year, but again, they can still lay those eggs at multiple sites. And they are temperature sensitive, so they will not disperse below 57 degrees or above 86 degrees. So there is some seasonality and temperature sensitivity there. But this immediately makes me think of, well, what about climate change? With our warming temperatures, how is this going to impact the dynamics of how these adult spruce budworm moths fly and spread their population? Could they potentially have more time to fly in the summer when the temperatures are favorable for those moths? It's all something to think about as we go into the future. So those adult moths are flying, and then they lay their eggs. And they lay their eggs on the ends of needles in what we call egg masses. And these egg masses typically include, on average, about 20 eggs per egg mass, and each spruce budworm moth can lay up to 10 egg masses per year. So on average, this could be 200 eggs total that they're laying. And again, they can spread those across wide distances. So that is a lot of eggs that they're laying across the landscape. But of course, these eggs are susceptible to predation by some of the insects and other animals that Sarah was talking about earlier. But they are typically only in their egg form for about 8 to 12 days before they hatch. But there are, like I said, some natural controls in the form of predators that can kill off those eggs. So those eggs hatch, and then they develop into larvae. And when those larvae first come out of the egg, they're going to put almost all of their energy towards spinning a web and creating what we call a hibernaculum, which is just this kind of webby enclosure at the ends of twigs. And the larvae will go into that hibernaculum in August, and they will overwinter until May. So they'll pretty much hibernate over the winter, and then they'll come out the following spring and just start going crazy, eating the buds, the new growth on the trees, and just eating and eating and eating. And so these larvae actually have been shown to be pretty sensitive to harsh winters. So very harsh, cold winters have been shown to decrease the population of spruce budworm by killing off that larvae. And then on the other hand, larvae will prefer really dry, hot summers. And so again, it makes me think of climate change. If our winters get a little bit more mild, maybe a little bit shorter, and then we have warmer summers, does that mean we're going to have less larvae dying off as a result of those really harsh winters? Oh, and then I forgot to mention here that they are feeding in May and June specifically. And those larvae will eat and eat and eat, and then they'll go into what we call the pupa. Like Sarah said, it kind of looks like a ice cream cone on the branches of the trees. And so they'll eat, and then they'll go into the pupa, and then they'll be in there for about 10 days, and then they'll emerge as an adult moth after those 10 days, and the cycle starts over again, where the adult moths will fly, lay their eggs, and the cycle continues. And we typically see the impacts of the feeding from the larvae in July, and we see those impacts in the form of that reddened foliage where the tips of the branches look kind of burnt. And so we start seeing those impacts of feeding manifesting typically in July. Okay, so we walked through the first part of this presentation thinking about the identification, ecology, and history of spruce budworm. Now let's start thinking about the impacts of spruce budworm on our trees and our forests. So we're going to start first on the tree level and then expand to more of a forest level. So the spruce budworm eats the buds of the tree, and those buds are what are required for new growth each year on that tree. And so this means that the budworm is preventing new growth on the tree. And if trees aren't growing, that means that they're not thriving. So when the spruce budworm is constantly eating those new buds, that means that that tree is constantly stressed because it's not able to grow and access the resources that it needs. And trees have a priority list of what they put their energy towards. And so that could be growing straight up, putting on diameter growth, growing out their roots, or fighting off diseases and insects. And so when they are already being attacked by something like spruce budworm, they're putting all of their energy towards fighting off that insect and putting on new growth, because again, if they aren't growing, they're not thriving. And so they are constantly stressed from the spruce budworm. And this becomes an issue because those stressors can compound. So if you already have stress from spruce budworm and then you add in a drought or crazy winters with multiple freeze-thaw cycles, all of those different stressors stack on top of each other, and that can be too much for the tree to bear. And that is what can lead to mortality. So typically one stressor isn't enough to kill the tree, but when you start stacking those on top of each other, that can just be too much stress and lead to the death of the tree. And so that is why we are seeing that widespread balsam fir and white spruce across the landscape. So now let's think a little bit more broadly. We were just talking about why we see mortality on the tree level. Let's think about the impacts of that more on a forest landscape level. So we know we have a lot more dead balsam fir on the landscape due to spruce budworm. And a big reason why spruce budworm is such a big issue is because we have so much balsam fir in our forests. But why do we have so much balsam fir in the first place? And this is because balsam fir is typically a species that would be burnt off during wildfires. And wildfire is a natural part of our landscape, but we have been suppressing wildfires in the last couple hundred years. And so this has led to that buildup of balsam fir on our landscape, which that compounds with spruce budworm because there's so much fir to eat. So spruce budworm eats all that balsam fir, leading to widespread dead balsam fir on our landscape. And that dead balsam fir is perfect fuel for a wildfire, for example, like in the Greenwood fire. So, and when those trees ignite, that releases a lot of carbon back into the atmosphere. And with climate change, we want to be keeping as much carbon in our forests and forest products as possible. And so it's just this very interconnected feedback loop of fire and balsam fir and other stressors as well that have led to that overabundance of balsam fir and so much dead balsam on the landscape. And so thinking about specifically those spruce fir forests where they are primarily made out of white spruce and balsam fir, when spruce budworm impacts those forests, they are losing resilience. And when I say resilience, I just mean that there is diversity in the forest so that if one species is lost, there is another species that can fulfill that role in the ecosystem. So it's something that we call functional redundancies. There's multiple players that can fill in for that species if it's lost to something like spruce budworm. But in forests that are made primarily out of spruce and balsam fir, both of those species are very susceptible to spruce budworm. So if those die off as a result of budworm, there's nothing else that can fill in its place. It's going to be losing a lot of resilience and not be a healthy, vigorous forest. And of course, there are economic impacts because we're losing merchantable timber when spruce and balsam fir are lost to spruce budworm. And this has negative impacts on our wood supply and our markets here in Northeast Minnesota. So I'm talking a lot about the negative impacts of spruce budworm on our forests, but I really want to emphasize that disturbance is a natural part of our landscape. Like Sarah said, spruce budworm is a native insect, and it's just one example of disturbances. The disturbances are just one part of the life cycle of Minnesota forests, and they can take the form of damage from heavy snow during the winter, other pests and diseases, fire, or flooding from ecosystem engineers like beavers. So disturbance is just one part of the very long story of Minnesota forests. And forests are dynamic, they're not static, they are always changing and they will continue changing far into the future. And so even if they experience negative impacts from spruce budworm, they will continue on, maybe in some different form, they will respond, they will adapt to that disturbance. So now let's think specifically about what are management actions that you can take in your woodlands and your yards to manage spruce budworm. I'm going to talk specifically about forest management actions that you can take in woodlands, and then Sarah will talk about management for yard trees specifically. And this image that I'm showing here was taken this year over the Superior National Forest. And this is showing a spruce fir forest on the left and a pine forest on the right. And so this is impacted by spruce budworm, showing that widespread mortality compared to the non-preferable host, which is pine for spruce budworm. And so this really illustrates the idea of resilience that I was just talking about, where in the spruce fir stand, both of those species are lost to spruce budworm, and there are no other trees, maybe one or two individuals that are left. So there are no other players that can fill in those roles, come in from the understory, and fulfill the role that balsam fir and spruce had. And so this is going to take a much longer time scale for this forest to recover, for those little maybe maple seedlings and other species in the understory to grow back up and take over. But there are no other dominant overstory trees besides spruce and fir, which is very different from this pine stand, which you can see is doing very well in the face of spruce budworm. So thinking about management actions, the most important first step is to get connected with a local forester. And there are many different ways that you can get connected with a professional, whether that's a forester or someone else. But a really good first step is usually to get in touch with your local soil and water conservation district. I do want to mention, though, that especially Cook and Lake County, that there has been such a big influx of requests for spruce budworm work that there are pretty long wait times at the moment. So that's something to be aware of when you go to your soil and water conservation district to try to get help with spruce budworm. Another option for those of you who own woodlands is the Minnesota Forestry Association. They have a call before you cut program where you can get a free visit from a forester to help you create a plan for your woodland and think about what are feasible next steps to manage your woodland. The Minnesota DNR has their private forest management program. That's another option. And then if you want to get connected directly with a logger, you could reach out to the mill in town. If you're up in this area, Headstrom's, they can get you connected with a logger and think about your options for harvesting timber on your land. So there are many different options, and these are just some great first steps for folks to reach out to. And so when you work with a forester, you're going to create a plan for your woodland. And your plan is shaped by the goals and objectives that you have for your woodland. So if you want to manage spruce budworm, but you also want to increase climate resilience or improve wildlife habitat, these are all taken into account. But I highly recommend when you're creating that plan, that resilience is at the top of your mind. And we can increase resilience, which is going to improve how forests can withstand and adapt to disturbances, including the very broad impacts of climate change. And we do that in a few different ways. The top way is just harvesting in order to open up growing space in the woodland. And when I say growing space, this is not only the physical space, but also the resources that trees need to grow. So if trees don't have enough growing space, they are not accessing the resources that they need, which means they're going to be stressed, unhealthy, and of poor vigor. So if we go in and open up growing space, this makes sure that trees can access the resources that they need, whether that's light, water, or nutrients, and they can be more vigorous and resilient to the future impacts of disturbances. And so in addition to various thinning strategies and harvesting strategies, you can also promote a mix of species, whether that's through what you plant or how you promote what regenerates following a harvest. So you want to make sure that that future overstory is going to be diverse. So we don't want a monoculture. We want more, hopefully, than 2 species in that overstory. So again, there's that functional redundancy. So there are multiple players in the ecosystem fulfilling multiple roles. So thinking specifically about actions focused on spruce budworm, when you're thinking about your management plan, there are two questions that you need to consider when you're thinking about managing for spruce budworm. First, how much balsam fir do you have? Does your stand consist primarily of balsam fir, or is it white spruce, balsam fir, and maybe another mix of species? Secondly, what are the conditions of your woodland? How old is it? What is the density of trees in the woodland, which we call stocking? And then what is the health and the vigor of those individual trees? You're going to tailor your management plan based off of these questions so that you can minimize losses from spruce budworm. So now let's consider a situation where your woodland is made primarily out of balsam fir. And knowing balsam fir and how it grows, it's probably very dense, where the trees are right next to each other. They're probably pretty skinny and just very densely packed forest. And up here, there's probably a good chance that that stand is already infested, experiencing some level of defoliation. So it's made primarily out of balsam fir, and then you want to see what is the health and vigor of the trees in that forest. You can figure that out by looking at what we call the live crown ratio. The live crown ratio is just the size of the tree crown compared to the total height of the tree. So a tree with a low live crown ratio is going to have a very small, scraggly looking tree. And when this is happening, we know that the tree is not photosynthesizing like it should. It's not accessing the resources that it needs, and therefore it's of poor health and vigor. And so in this situation where you have a very dense stand of balsam fir, the trees are unhealthy, and it's likely it could already be infested to some degree, the best option is to get in there and try to harvest as soon as you can, because you want to try to hopefully get some type of value out of the wood while also spreading or preventing the spread of spruce budworm to nearby stands as well. And usually for a balsam fir stand in this situation, the best option would be a clear cut, just so you can start fresh and try to get rid of spruce budworm in that stand as quickly as possible. But I do need to say that unfortunately, the current market for balsam fir up in this part of the state is pretty poor, just due to changes in how much balsam fir local mills are accepting. So they are accepting less balsam than they have in the past, which means there's less demand. And so the market for balsam fir is currently poor. So then the best option, instead of selling your wood, would be to cut and pile the balsam fir. And this isn't all bad, because these piles can have really good wildlife benefits for certain mammal species and others. But unfortunately, it can be kind of hard at the moment to try to get value out of that balsam fir. And dead and dying wood doesn't have value. And so that balsam fir that you were cutting would have to be of good health and vigor, which can be kind of hard to find at the moment. And so when we think about stands that are primarily made out of white spruce compared to stands that are made out of balsam fir, usually we want to start thinking about how we can go in there to thin that spruce stand. And so we have to think about a few different scenarios. But just basically, if you have younger, healthier spruce trees, you can go in there and thin the woodland, because those trees are very likely to respond to the thinning. They're going to be vigorous after that thinning, because young trees are growing at a much higher rate. So when they're suppressed, they're younger, they just want to grow. So if you go in there and open up growing space, they're going to respond to that opening up of space, and they're going to put on diameter growth, they're going to put up height growth, and they're going to respond by growing after that thinning. On the other hand, if your spruce stand is older and already experiencing an outbreak, it's not recommended to go in there and thin. And I'll talk about that in more detail here on the next slide. So there are some situations where spruce stands are not going to respond to a thinning, and we would want to consider some other management strategies, such as more full-scale harvest, whether that's a clear cut or a group harvest or any other silvicultural technique. So why wouldn't you want to thin a spruce stand? I'll start with the first one that I just mentioned, where we don't want to thin spruce stands that are older and very dense and then have never been thinned. And this is because older trees, their growth plateaus. So if we were to go in there and thin and open up growing space, they don't have any more growing to do. So they're not going to respond to that thinning. They're not going to put on more growth through their diameter or their height. And so again, remember, young trees, they're growing very quickly. So when we go in there and thin, they want to grow. They want to put on that diameter and height. So they're going to respond But those old trees are all done growing. They're putting all their energy just towards maintaining and fighting off diseases and insects. So those trees are not going to respond in that situation. Same thing goes where we don't want to thin spruce stands during periods of drought or during current outbreaks. And this is because those trees are already stressed, whether that's by a drought or by a current outbreak. And like I said earlier, trees have that priority list of what they put their energy towards. So in those situations, they're putting all of their energy towards conserving their resources during the drought or fighting off the spruce budworm outbreak. So they won't have any excess energy to spend on putting on diameter growth and height growth when you go in there and thin. And so that thinning is just not going to be effective, and it's not going to improve the growth, unfortunately, at the end of the day. And so again, if you can't thin, you would have to talk to your forester about more large-scale harvesting plans. And so some things to know when we're thinking about harvesting more from a logistical point of view. Sarah talked to headstrums here in town, and they said that logging is really only going to make sense, make economic sense for people who have at least 15 to 20 acres of healthy spruce that are relatively large. And those logs need to be able to be cut into at least 16-foot lengths with 6-inch diameters. So very scraggly, unhealthy spruce is unfortunately probably not going to meet the bar to be sold to a local mill. And so again, this just makes us think about, are there some other strategies beyond selling timber to a local mill, but we can still harvest? So for example, cutting and piling, creating wildlife piles. And this is all something that you talk to your forester about to figure out what are the other options for harvesting within your woodland to make sure that spruce budworm doesn't keep causing mortality. And so now I'm all done talking about woodlands. I'm going to hand it over to Sarah to talk about yards.
Thanks. So some of you may not be living on 20 or 40 acres. You may just have a small amount of trees in your yard that you're concerned about. And the way we treat that is going to be slightly different than some of the actions that Anna was talking about. So when you're first thinking about your yard trees, before we even get to the fact that they're impacted by spruce budworm, you want to be giving those individual trees your very best chance at survival, to survive through any sort of stressor, budworm or drought or things like that. So some of the things you can do to help make sure the trees in your yard have their best chance of surviving are on this list that's up on the screen now. So thinning, like she was mentioning, on a big woodland scale is different in your yard, but thinking about making sure each tree has enough space to grow to its full potential. Mulching is a great idea around yard trees. If you don't have mulch around your trees, it can help a lot with retaining moisture in the soil. And also if you have younger trees, it can help prevent competition from other plants that might be trying to grow around them. And it helps make sure you don't nick that side of the tree with your mower when you're mowing your lawn too. So it shows on the screen here, you want to have kind of a donut of mulch with a few inches between the trunk of the tree and where the mulch starts. Make sure it's not hugged up against the tree. You don't want a volcano of mulch. You want a donut around it. And a few inches deep is good. You also want to make sure your trees are well watered. In a drought, if you have the ability to be watering your yard trees, go for it. A good rule of thumb is if they're getting less than an inch of precipitation each week, you can consider adding some water on your own, and watering down so that they're getting enough down to a depth of like 6 to 9 inches underground is good. You also really want to avoid impacting the soil right around where your trees are planted. So you don't want to be driving heavy machinery over where the tree's roots are. You don't want to be digging out the soil or adding more soil. You want to really leave the soil be right around where your trees are. And then of course you want to avoid using herbicides near your trees that might be impacting them. So now that you've given your trees the best possible chance of survival and you still have spruce budworm, what are some factors that are going to sway what you do with that tree? There's not a lot of options of what you can do with that tree when it is heavily impacted. Really, your options are to wait and see what happens, to cut the tree down, or to try and chemically treat the tree to prevent it from dying from budworm. So we'll talk through how some of that works, but these are some of the factors that you would consider in choosing between those options. Economic things, how much is it going to cost to have that tree removed? Is it near to your house? Could it fall on your house? What would be the cost of that if you did the wait and see approach? Versus how much is it going to cost to treat it chemically if you decide to do that? Ecologically, you might be thinking about the trees in your yard and what diversity there is. Do you want to be trying to increase the diversity of trees in your yard? So maybe it's a good thing to cut your losses with your balsam now and plant other things that are going to survive into the future. You could also be considering the age of that tree, what health it's in, and some of those other factors. As far as safety goes, if that tree falls, could it harm your property? Could it fall in your car, your garage? That's going to be a major factor in whether you wait and see or get it taken care of sooner. And then, of course, your personal values. Do you have really special meaning and attachment to a particular tree that you're going to focus a lot of resources on saving versus other trees that you might care less about for various reasons? And also, what goals do you have in your landscape? Are you looking to have more shade in your yard? That might impact which trees you plant instead. Are you trying to attract wildlife, screen a view from neighbors? There are trees that can help with all of those different things. If you are considering chemical treatment of yard trees, and again, this is just for a few trees that you might be trying to protect. It's not going to make economic sense on a woodland scale to be trying to spray trees in this type of outbreak. But if you are trying to protect a few trees, there are chemical options. And of course, with any chemical treatment we're considering in our yards and woods, safety is super important. Remembering that the label is the law, so the instructions on that pesticide label must be followed exactly, both in terms of the percents that you're mixing, and then also protecting yourself with personal protective gear if you're going to be using a pesticide. For budworm, you have to make sure that you're choosing the right product, that you're using it at the right time of year, and that you're covering the tree properly for it to work. In terms of choosing the right product, most places recommend using something called BTK, which is this long name here that's referencing a bacteria that's found naturally in soil. BTK is a pesticide spray that gets used in lots of different applications, both in agriculture and in trees and ornamental trees in people's yards. It is approved for use in organic agriculture. It does not have harmful effects on humans. The way that it works is that it's sprayed onto the plant or the tree, and then the insect has to ingest that part of the plant that it's sprayed on. So in this case, the budworm has to eat those needles, and then the product activates inside the digestive system of the budworm. They stop eating, and then they die within hours to a few days. BTK breaks down really quickly in the environment, so it's only effective for a couple of days after you spray it on the tree. So you have to really time that application with the time of year when the budworm has hatched and is actively feeding on those needles. So you'd want to see the budworm out. Bud break has already happened. That fresh green growth is there. That would be the time of year in late May when you would consider spraying something like that. Pros and cons, again, the timing is really important, and also coverage of the tree. If you're considering doing this yourself, budworm is really going to be heavily feeding at the top of your tree. So if you can only reach the bottom part, it's not going to save your tree. So you'd have to consider how big your tree is, what equipment you have for treating it in those factors. There is a company in our area offering professional spraying of trees for yards and cabin sites. That's North Shore Pest Management. They're using actually a different product than BTK, something called acelepryn, which is mixed with a sticking agent. So it stays on the foliage for about a month instead of just a couple of days. They explained to me the reason they've chosen that product is because the nature of their business, they're treating a large number of home sites. And in order to get to all of those places, they have a small crew. They have to have something that's going to last on the tree longer, because that 2 to 3 day time window with BTK, they're just not going to be able to get to everybody's houses and do it right at the same time, if that makes sense. So it works in a similar manner to BTK, but it's lasting on those trees a lot longer. So I've had people asking me questions for, from an environmental perspective, what other insects or other animals could be impacted by these chemicals in the environment. And the answer really depends kind of on what you're using and the timing. But if you're thinking about the fact that the insect has to ingest the part of the plant that it's on in order for it to impact them, that means it has to be another caterpillar that's out at the same time of year, that's on the plant that you've sprayed, that eats it in order for it to die. So it's not like chemicals that just touch the insect that make them kill. This is when they have to actually eat it. And I haven't found a lot of scientific research about, non-target species being impacted from BTK spraying for spruce budworm. So I think it's definitely possible that there are other caterpillars out at that time of year, but I do think the impacts are going to be rather minimal compared to other things that you could be spraying that, kill everything upon impact. It doesn't impact bees and other pollinators in that way. And it does not have harmful impacts to human health. We don't have the same digestive system as budworms do, so it doesn't, activate in us in the way it does in budworms. Of course, you're also going to have to consider the economic cost of this if you're considering doing chemical spraying. Since we're in, year 2 or 3 of what could be a 6 to 10 year outbreak, the moths fly around and lay their eggs, so it's something you have to repeat year after year after year. If you're considering using North Shore Pest Management, they did let me know that they charge both a travel fee and then they charge per the amount of product they're having to use to treat the trees at your site. So if you're doing just one tree, it'll feel rather expensive. The price per tree goes down the more trees you're treating. But again, you're not going to be doing this to a large number of trees. This would just be to a few trees on a property. So you're thinking probably in the range of a few $100s that you would be investing in this year after year during this outbreak. So it's a lot to consider in chemical treatment versus waiting and seeing versus removing trees. And just like I mentioned a couple slides back, your decision might be different than your next door neighbor's based on all these different factors that you're thinking about in your yard and your trees that you have. And I think it's also important to note that whether or not you chemically treat trees on your yard for spruce budworm is going to have little to no impact on the overall outbreak. Because you think about what percent of land is even privately owned in Cook County is very small. Then the percent of land that people are going to be using this chemical treatment on. Overall, the budworm is going to have its outbreak either way. It's more about the decisions you're making about the individual trees that you're thinking about trying to protect from possible mortality or not. And there's not one right or wrong answer to that question. So we'll have a couple of key takeaways and then we'll switch over to Firewise.
So we covered a lot of ground in this presentation. I just want to remind you that this is being recorded, and so you'll be able to view it at a later date if you missed anything that you'd like to pick up on later. But just in terms of key points, number 1 is that spruce budworm is a native insect in Minnesota, and its preferred species are number 1, balsam fir, and number 2, white spruce. It does feed on other things like black spruce and some pines, but those 2 species are its number 1 preferred food, starting with balsam fir. And then the forest impacts that we see across our landscape are widespread defoliation, so the loss and death of leaves, and widespread mortality of those trees. In woodland specifically, management strategies are going to depend on the size of your woodland. What is the density of the tree, so the stalking in your woodland, and what's the composition, how much balsam fir versus spruce is in your woodland. And then for yard trees, chemical treatment is just one option that's available for you. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Aaron from Firewise and chat more about that.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Aaron. I'm the Firewise coordinator for Cook and Lake County here. So first thing I wanted to touch on, which we did a little bit though, is is the sort of wildfire history on our landscape in the area here. So wildfire has been present on our landscape for thousands of years. At least since post glaciation period, it's been a component on the landscape, and because of that, our forests are what are called fire adapted ecosystems. And what that means is that because fire has existed on the landscape for so long, that all the systems that kind of keep everything healthy and in check and in equilibrium depend on wildfire for those processes to come through. Now, over the last 200 some odd years, we have been suppressing pretty much all wildfires on the landscape. Now, before that, Native Americans used wildfire and understood it pretty well to actively manage the landscape. And since we've been suppressing wildfire, we have we've kind of built up a scenario where we're really in a scenario where it's pretty detrimental, the different levels of different species on our landscape. And the main thing is that we have, you know, a way overabundance of balsam fir. So what would have happened in, you know, if we did allow wildfires to be much more present on the landscape is between every 5 to maybe 50 years, you could expect a wildfire on the landscape in any one point that you might drop a pin down on a map, and fire would be very common. So it would also sort of look and represent more of a mosaic pattern than, you know, one large forest of one type of, you know, treatment area. So what that means is that in any given area, maybe a certain little piece of forest may be burned 5 years ago. Adjacent to that, you may have a forest that maybe hasn't burned for 50 or so years. And then maybe adjacent to that, you had a fire come through that maybe was catastrophic and burnt off the whole thing maybe this year or something like that. So you'd have these 3 or you know, more different types of forest conditions next to each other. And it would have been, like I said, more of a mosaic. And because of that, it would have been much more resilient. The disturbance that a wildfire would have would be much less of an impact during those periods than it is now. Now, when we get a wildfire, there's much more potential for it to be catastrophic and to be stand replacing, even though that still would have happened in smaller quantities and smaller times and areas in the past. Now it's becoming much more of a problem on our landscape that when we do get wildfires, they have so much of a potential to be stand clearing and catastrophic. You know, because of all this, as I mentioned, we have this humongous buildup of balsam fir on our landscape. It's generally an understory tree, though some of them can get pretty big given the right opportunity. But generally, you're going to find it under you know, our pines and our overstory trees, and quite a bit of an abundance right now. And you're going to find, you know, near monocultures of that. And though you may have found that on the landscape earlier in lower quantities, the amount that we have is somewhere between, I've heard statistics thrown around 200 to 300%, either way too much on the landscape. And balsam fir is simply the most volatile fuel in our forest that we have. Spruce is also pretty volatile, but it doesn't have the same amount of it that balsam fir has. And what I mean by volatile is it has a great potential to cause and spread wildfires. Let's talk about the 3 factors that generally influence wildfire on our landscape. There are 3 main ones. First off is topography. You know, that's simply just the slope of the landscape. You know, the higher the slope, the more it's sort of an exponential scenario where the more slope, the more wildfire may spread, the more potential it has to spread. So if you're on a hill, it's going to greatly increase the chances of a fire kind of moving up that hill. Weather is a big one. So wind, relative humidity, and temperature are 3 main factors that we want to consider when thinking about wildfire potential. Wind has the potential to obviously move fire pretty fast. So the higher the wind, the worse it is. Humidity is going to really influence whether a fire starts or not. So if we're in a high humidity you know, scenario, then it's going to be pretty difficult for fires to even start. And then temperature obviously influences everything in regards to those 2 things. And then fuel, which is the biggest thing that we can have an impact on, is also the main component. If there's no fuel, there's no potential for fire. And what I mean by fuel is obviously most of our vegetation, so trees, brush, understory, things like that, anything organic in the woods has the potential to be a fuel. Now, this also means that our structures that we live in, you know, our cabins, our homes, anything on our private land that is man-made, that is also tends to be a fuel. So these are the things that we can influence on our properties and in our forests that we have, you know, that we're lucky enough to have up here to help mitigate wildfire going forward. And just simply extreme wildfire behavior normally consists, you know, of a combination of, you know, high wind, high temperatures, and excessive fuel loads. And again, the fuel loads are what we can directly mitigate on our properties. So next, let's talk about indeed mitigating some of these risks and dealing with, you know, our balsam on our properties. So when we're thinking about firewise principles on our property, you know, there's a simple little diagram here that shows you a few different zones. I'm going to be talking about 4 zones that we want to actively manage on our properties in the woods here. So the first one that we're going to talk about is the home zone. Now that simply means your structure, your cabin, your home, your garage, your sheds, fences, decks, docks, anything man-made on your property, I will consider your home zone. In addition to, I also want you to think of your driveways and your roads also as part of your home zone as well. And when we're thinking about firewise, we want to think about from those areas outward. So we're starting in the home zone. So first thing that we want to consider is, what is your home made out of? You know, the different materials. What is the condition of these materials? Is your roof an old roof that's degraded? You know, the best thing to do with a roof is to have a new one. So new asphalt shingles are pretty resilient when it comes to wildfire potential. In addition to that, metal roofs are sort of the best option as far as preventing spread of wildfire into your home. However, those tend to be a bit more expensive. But either way, a newer roof is going to be far more resilient than any old roof material that you may have, sort of regardless of what it's made out of. The new asphalt is very resilient. We want to think about what our homes, you know, the siding is made out of. The worst thing you can absolutely have is a vinyl siding. In the event of a wildfire, that's just going to melt away and expose anything behind it, and all that's going to be pretty flammable, and you're going to lose your structure. In addition to that, wood siding doesn't tend to be very resilient either. Maybe you have a cedar siding, and you know, that also is going to have a high potential to, you know, carry a fire into your home. So what things you might want to be considering replacing those with, or maybe you want to build a new structure, is, you know, hardy board. It tends to be pretty good at being resilient, or a metal siding obviously is going to keep, risk pretty low. Get this question a lot too. Some folks are lucky enough to have, you know, true log cabins. Now those actually are fairly resilient when it comes to wildfire. It takes quite a bit of energy for a big old log to get going up. So you're pretty safe if you do have one of those. So another thing I see all the time is, you know, where are you folks storing your storing your firewood? Now I know a lot of folks, especially, you know, they come up, especially if it's maybe just for fun up here or whatever, you have your wood pile next to your structure on your porch, things like that. And really that is the absolute worst place you can store your firewood. Wildfire in our area generally is going to spread via firebrands and embers getting thrown away from the main fire. Now, of course, you know, we do encounter situations where that wall of flame is encroaching on our land. However, most of the time, what we want to be thinking about to mitigate wildfire in our land is not that. We want to be thinking about these embers getting thrown 2, 3, 4 miles away from, you know, the main fire and landing on your property. So if one of those embers happens to land on your wood pile, suddenly you've caused a new vector for a fire, and you might have, you know, a new fire starting on your property that is going to divert resources away from the main fire down the road. Additionally, a lot of folks like to store lumber, different materials under exposed foundations. That's the same kind of big hazard that I see. You really shouldn't be storing flammable material next, under, adjacent to your structures. You want to keep that stuff as far away as possible from, you know, from your homes. So again, touching on these open foundations, maybe you have a deck. These are all going to be vectors, again, for these sparks to come in and start a new fire. What you want to do is, if you have an exposed foundation, or a deck that's kind of up off the ground, you're going to want to do one of a couple things. Number one is simply just clearing out all the needles, the duff, any organic material that's going to be collecting there. You want to do that a few times a year, as many times as possible, just so you don't have a fuel load building up under there. Now, sometimes those areas can be pretty hard to clean. Maybe you don't want to do that and invest all this time in actively cleaning this stuff out. Now, the option would be to line your foundation and your decks with a fine metal hardware mesh. And that's going to keep a lot of this organic material from collecting under there. That way you don't have to spend as much time actively managing it. And what a lot of folks tend to do just to make it look nice is put a lattice in front of it to make it look a little bit more appealing. Yeah, so, you know, a couple other things I'd like to note too. Pay attention to your soffits. Are they open? Maybe you have an attic vent as well. We often do on our structures. So you want to put mesh behind an attic vent as well to prevent sparks and things flying in there. You want to close off any opening that you may have on your structure, because simply if maybe the wildfire is close by, maybe it's on your property, there's going to be a pressure difference between the fire and your home. It's going to be a lot cooler in your home. Obviously the fire is hot, and what that's going to do is if there's any opening, it's actually going to suck in like a vacuum, any debris, any flammable material is going to get sucked into those vents and openings as well. So you want to be diligent about closing off any vector for that to come into your house, because again, even if the outside of your structure is fairly resilient and less flammable, the inside of your structures definitely aren't. So after the home zone, this is where we want to talk about what to do with our trees on our land. So the first zone that we want to talk about is 0 to 30 feet from our structures and, you know, our roads, our access, all the things I outlined earlier. Now, this is the area that you want to heavily manage your balsam and other tree species on your properties. The reason that 30 feet is sort of identified as this zone is, imagine a wildfire is actually on your property, a pretty big one. 30 feet is generally the maximum range that radiant heat is going to be able to transfer enough energy to start something else on fire. Beyond that 30 feet, you're pretty safe from that standpoint. So again, you want to focus on the sparks and embers on your property, but if you have the majority of the fuel cleared from that 30 feet, the risk of that wall of flame actually even burning your house down is pretty low comparatively. So in this 30-foot zone, I do highly recommend that you remove absolutely all of the balsam fir in that zone, no matter whether it's alive, dead, dying, no matter the conditions. I really do not recommend any balsam fir within that 30 feet zone to be on your property. As I stated earlier, and as we've been talking about, it is very volatile. It doesn't take much, whether it's alive or dead, to get going. And it's going to be a vector to spread that fire into the overstory trees, which is what is going to cause a catastrophic fire on your property. It's what's called a ladder fuel to you know, firefighters and different folks in the industry. The reason that is you know, say you have a lightning strike or something like that, or just a low-level ground fire, which generally isn't a huge hazard taken in itself, but suddenly you add the balsam fir component into it, it's going to take a small little spark and it's going to vector that fire up to the overstories of our more prized overstory trees, you know, our pines and things like that. So it's going to be what causes maybe a healthy low-level fire that our landscape wants and needs to be a catastrophic fire where suddenly we're losing everything, including our homes. So as I said, we should be removing all of our balsam from this area, but you know, sometimes we want to think about what to prioritize first. It's a big job. So what you want to focus on is the smaller diameter balsams first. The smaller the tree in general, the more, you know, when we're talking about balsam, the more potential it has for fire and volatility. The larger diameter trees, as they get bigger, they're going to be a bit easier to manage as far as, you know, there's different tactics you can use. If you have a nice big spruce tree, perhaps instead of removing it, you could limit up so the branches are hanging at least 6 feet off the ground. And again, that's going to keep one of these, you know, maybe a lightning strike or something like that from vectoring fire up, as long as it's about 6 feet or more up the ground. And again, that's where the limbs hang, not where the whirl starts. So think about that. You know, in addition to that, you know, you should be mowing your lawns periodically, you know, keeping brush and other things at a nice low level as well within this 30-foot zone. So beyond that, we're going to talk about the 30-foot to 100-foot zones. Now, this is going to be pretty similar to the first zone, except for now we don't necessarily recommend removing all of the hazardous fuels from this area. You still want to remove many of them, most of them, if you can. But again, you can start prioritizing, paying attention to more about size. So again, focusing on the small stuff, focusing really on clumps and, big groups of the balsam fir is what you want to prevent. Individuals, though, less of an issue. If you have a single tree and it torches, it's not as big of a risk, obviously, as if you have a whole group of trees and they all torch at once. That's what's going to spread it. So when we're talking about spacing, you want at least 10 feet spacing with our conifers. This isn't just for balsam. This is for any conifer you have in your forest here. You want at least 10 feet, if not more. The more, the better. And what you really want to be thinking about is, what is this tree going to look like if it isn't already, when it's grown up and at its full potential? You want to be looking up and seeing what the crowns are doing. And if the crowns are touching, that's an issue, because again, that's what's going to spread wildfire. A single tree burning in the woods isn't a huge risk if it's, has adequate spacing when we're talking about conifers. And again, when we talk about wildfire potential, we are really focusing on managing our conifers. Even though our deciduous trees are fuels, and yes, they will burn in the right conditions, they're not really going to be what starts a fire, and they're not really going to be what spreads a fire in most cases. They're generally going to be burning when it gets so bad that, everything's burning. It's not going to be the driving force. So again, we want to prioritize managing our conifers. And in this zone too, you may want to think about replacing some of the conifers and some of the fir with some other species. We talked a little about diversity. You want as much diversity on your landscape as possible. So a couple recommendations I have, if you are inclined to be planting and replacing some of your balsam on your landscape. We predict with climate change that oaks and maples are probably going to be a bit more prevalent and a bit more of a, they're going to thrive a bit more and be more overstory trees potentially in the future here. So I highly recommend replacing some of our conifers with those. We're still going to have most of our species on the landscape. Again, the mix and, conditions are definitely going to change in the future. So then let's talk about after that 100 feet. So this is going to be very similar to the zone before. It's just you're going to, you need to manage a little bit less in this case. Again, you want to prioritize that 10-foot spacing. You want to prioritize crowns not touching, but maybe, maybe you only actively manage some of your dead trees in this area. It's far less important to go crazy with this area than it is the other two areas. Nonetheless, it's important to keep managing those areas, especially, maybe that's the intermediate area between you and your neighbors. You may want to consider treating that more like the previous zones if that makes sense to you. So beyond that, I just want to talk about a few resources that Cook County has for landowners in the area to help folks kind of manage balsam and other hazardous fuels going forward. So first off, we do have 7 Firewise brush disposal sites in the county that you are all welcome to take advantage of. So you can take balsam you've cut there and drop it on our big pile, and that's a free service that we provide for everybody here. We do have 7 of them. There's a few up the Gunflint and then a few dispersed kind of off the highway throughout the whole county. If you want to take a look at a map for that, you can visit cookcountyfirewise.org. And, in there, there'll be a link to, we have a nice interactive map that'll show you where all those different brush disposal sites are and tell you how to get to them. Basically, you can always drop stuff off there until you can't get in, meaning until there's enough snow on the ground that it's not accessible. We definitely don't plow them or anything during the winter. Beyond that, if anybody's interested in having a Firewise inspection done by myself on your land, then we can set up a time where I can come out and visit with you and, first off, do a risk assessment of your property. I'll look at your structure, I'll look at your woods, and we can prioritize what, maybe you should be doing and what you should be thinking about doing first here. So if anybody's interested in that, I'll put my information up here at the end here, and feel free to reach out to me and we can set up a time that I can visit with you. Beyond that, we do have in the county, if you're interested in as a community, maybe you have a lake association already, as a community becoming a recognized Firewise community, then there are additional resources then that I have available to help these communities out. Every year I kind of apply for a specific grant for these areas, and what that grant money helps me do is organize things like chipper days, brush removal days, things like that, where the whole community has a, as a whole does a bunch of work on their land, and then I can maybe help facilitate removing that fuel from your property and getting it to one of our sites. Because often that's one of the hardest parts for people is, maybe they can cut down a few trees themselves, but then what do they do with it? Beyond that, in these communities too, we also will offer a limited cost share program. So we will match up to $500. Say if you get a contractor to come out, do some work, if you're involved in one of these communities, we'll match up to $500 with that. And then one other grant funding thing I'd like everybody to be aware of, specifically for those who live mid-trail on the Gunflint Trail, I do have a specific fuels reduction grant available for that area to help some folks with some balsam clearing as well. So if you're interested in any of those, you can visit our cookcountyfirewise.org, or here's my information. Feel free to write it down. Now, I would request that best way to get a hold of me is to email me. That way I have a nice record. I am fairly busy working in both counties, and I do try to keep up on my phone, but the best thing to do would be to email me. And we can set up a time for me to visit with any of these things that we're interested in. And I did want to touch on one other thing. We had a presentation earlier. They had a few questions about, say you do cut some trees on your land, and maybe you can't move it. And what else? What are the other options? So cutting and piling is one option. We talked about it earlier, that has some benefits to wildlife and things like that. It may provide a limited fire risk because you do have a pile of fuel, but it is significantly less than a standing dead or alive balsam on your property. So it is an improvement, and the benefit also is it's going to rot and reintroduce, a lot of those nutrients back into the soil, which is a benefit. Couple other things you can do is you can definitely burn those piles in the wintertime. Generally, when contractors, if you hire a contractor to do a bunch of fuels reduction work on your property, that's generally how they're going to get rid of it if that's part of the contract. You can also, rent or buy a chipper and send all that stuff through and kind of disperse that on the forest floor. That's going to have the benefit of reintroducing most of the nutrients back into it, and that really doesn't provide any sort of risk at all for fire, and you're not introducing any of the carbon back into the atmosphere as well that way. Additionally, I got a couple questions about what to do with, bigger blowdown and things like that on your property. And, generally what I recommend for that is if it's a nice big, maybe a pine fell down or something like that. Number one, they don't provide a huge risk for wildfire potential, but there may be some if they're heavily, have heavy foliage on them. But the best thing you can do is sort of buck those big logs up. That way they'll sit on the ground well, and they'll kind of rot a bit faster than if it's just kind of standing above the ground. So the best thing to do is cut those pieces up and kind of disperse it on the ground as best as you can, and maybe try to remove some of the branches and where the needles are as much as you can to reduce the hazard for wildfire. So I think that's about all I have for you guys, and now we'll have a quick present. We'll have questions and things like that and discussion.
And one of the last questions we had in the last group was about, do you serve Lake County, and does it look similar as their grant?
Oh, yes. So as I mentioned, I'm also the Firewise coordinator for Lake County as well. So maybe some of you folks are from Lake County, and all these services are pretty much the same thing for Lake County as well. We have brush disposal sites there. Unfortunately, Lake County has a different website, so we don't have a nice interactive map. But if you need to know where our brush disposal sites, send me an email. I can send you a nice little map that I have of those. In addition to grant funding, there's some other grant funding, but it'd be best if you just talk one-on-one for Lake County, those in Lake County with me.
Well, invite you guys over, and we'll start for more questions.
As we're doing questions, oh yeah, go
We
ahead.
do have contact info for Cook and Lake SWCDs, and they have information in the back. And then both Sarah and I have our business cards in the back. You can feel free to reach out at any time.
And Cook County Soil and Water wasn't able to come, but they gave a great handout about some cost share programs that are available here in Cook County for budworm work. So make sure to grab one of those handouts from Cook County Soil and Water. We also brought some examples of branches that show some really good feeding from budworm that we can pass around. And you can look on these branches for that messy kind of webbing tip on the ends. That's a great thing to look for. You can also see the defoliation where they ate off the new growth. And you can be looking for the pupa casings. There's one hanging out right here and several others on this, the little brown kind of cone shape. So we'll pass these around for people to look at. And are there questions?